to another episode of Live Today Health Talk. And how many of you on time today with that spring forward that you had your clocks ready and you made it to church or wherever else you needed to go today and you did not say, oh, is it time to get up already? Well, welcome to setting it forward for spring and enjoying the sun, right? So now with that setting forward, we're supposed to get a little bit more sunlight. Isn't that the purpose of it? So let's enjoy. With the vaccines coming and people are already starting to unmask. Have you noticed that? When you go different places, a lot of people aren't wearing their mask anymore. So let's see if this spring and this summer we can finally be, and can I say it? COVID free, right? All right. So before I go any further, let me bless this platform, and then share the word for today and get into our women's history. So, most gracious and heavenly Father, as always, we thank you for this platform. We thank you for technology, and thank you for all the things that you've brought us through concerning the platform. Wow. Certain things we can and cannot do. Father, I just pray that you will guide us in the right way and you will release any restrictions that any organizations or any of these social media platforms are trying to put on us. But you will humble me as well, Father, that I will do whatever it is I need to do to continue to share your health message in the way that you will have it. So, Father, I just bless the platform. Thank you for the streaming broadcast, inspirational network, Father. It is the place that you've sent me, Father, and I just know that you'll take care of it all. So I thank you for my engineer for working all those things that he works out in the background, Father. But I know at the end of the day, we want to give you all the honor and all the glory. Hallelujah. So I just want to say thank you. Amen. Amen. All right. So our scripture for today is coming from Isaiah 66:13. And this is right out of today's U version. As one whom his mother comforteth, so will I comfort you, and ye shall be comforted in Jerusalem. So he's got it, right? He's already told us he's in control and he's going to take care of it because he comforts us and he guides us through whatever it is. So right now it may look like a little minutia going on there. You know what? But let's see it forward and let's speak it forward as well. So it shall be done in his name and his way, So, hey, let's get ready. Women's history. So today, I'm going to share women in the military history, and I want to thank the women's some of our other women's military groups. So, Women Veteran United Committee, WAVUSI, WIMSA, and some of the other organizations that have given us some of the data, and of course YouTube, right? Giving us some of the data that we're going to share here today. Just talking about our women in the military and how heroic a lot of them are. And I hope that through that, as we talk about them not just being nurses, no. So in this history, you will also take pride in whatever it is our women out there are doing. Go out there and lift up your woman or the women in your life during this month. And don't just stop at this month though, right? But just pay homage where homage is due and thank them for all the things that they have done. Because I tell you, our women in the military, well, our women, period. But let's say the military, not only they are warriors, regardless of which branch of service they are in, but then their wives, their sisters, their mothers, their aunties, the list can just go on and on with all the titles that they wear, right? But at the end of the day, they want to come home and be loved and be safe and be cherished, be, letting them know that you care about them at the end of the day. And they just want to be able to come home and sit down once all their work is done, taking care of the children, the family, the husbands, the household chores, whatever. At the end of the day, and just be recognized for who they simply are, a woman, God's creation. And she was put here to do the things that she does. So just let her know how much you appreciate her during this month. And like Christmas, we say, don't just give the gift on Christmas Day. Remember to cherish her always. All right. So for our women in the military history, we're going to go through a bibliography and a timeline here, and we're going to go all the way back to the American Revolution. Yes, women served back in the American Revolution, and you don't hear about it a lot, right? But from 1778, December 29, there was a Creole woman, so I understand, named Sally St. Clair, and she was killed in action at the Battle of Savannah. She was discovered to be a woman only after her death. Now, sometimes I have to wonder and say, wow, how can our women deceive men, especially to be out there in the battlefield? And I know dressed in their clothing and everything, but some women just can't get away with that. I don't care what kind of clothes you put on, or your voice, or, if men are around you. It's like, how can you really get away with that? It's something that you're going to do or say, your mannerisms or something that's going to give you away. But at any rate, she was able to pull it off. And then you have to think of the bravery, the courage for her to even want to do such a thing back in those days, to pull it off. And they didn't discover she was a woman until she died. And by then they had to disrobe her. And I guess that's when they were all shocked. So wow. Hats off to Sally Claire for her bravery, but also for her heroism, just to be out there in the American Revolution, fighting for a cause. And I will never know, or can't tell you right now, what cause or what was in her mind as the cause that she felt as though she had to fight for. But just look at it. She was out there. All right. The next one for 1780 is Letta, a colored woman, cooks and does laundry for soldiers in the Continental Army at West Point. Her service is documented only in a brief reference in the pension disposition of Sarah Osborne, the wife of a white soldier who also served as an army cook and laundress. So Letta was undoubtedly not the only Black woman providing support services for the army, but the service of most women of that era, especially women of color, because it was not considered sufficiently important to document. But I just want to show you a brief film from Sarah, some of the documents that Sarah Osborne shared to let us know how that the quote unquote colored women were out there with her. So stay tuned for this first video.
Everyone knows about the famous men in the American Revolutionary War. George Washington, Benedict Arnold, Alexander Hamilton. They're all well known. You know what's not well known? The women who helped out behind the scenes. Honestly, massive kudos to them. Back then, women had barely any rights. But when the revolution rolled around, oh boy, they were practicing responsibilities and rights everywhere. Wives of husbands who were at war assumed their position in their businesses and took care of business things. Throughout the war, they became used to their position and began to enjoy the idea of owning property and having responsibilities. On top of that, there was this group of women called the Daughters of Liberty. They were made up of females who were like, hey, I want to help out too, and boycotted British goods and started making their own products. The Daughters of Liberty included Martha Washington, wife of George Washington. Besides the Daughters of Liberty, there were also women who were related to the men in the war who helped out at camp by cooking meals, repairing uniforms, cleaning, taking care of the injured, and looking for food. Sometimes, though, these women took action at the battlefield itself. A famous example was Mary Ludwig Hayes, or Molly Pitcher. Her primary job was to give water to the thirsty and hot soldiers. However, one day her husband, William Hayes, was injured in action, and instead of continuing to pass out water, Molly Pitcher took over his role as a gunner. She later gained a pension for her wartime service. By the way, a pension is basically a payment that you receive for working somewhere. Okay, on with the show! Similarly to Molly, Margaret Corbin also stepped up to her husband's position. She was the wife of John Corbin, an artilleryman who was killed at Fort Washington. When her husband passed away, Margaret filled in his place at the cannon and started to help in with sponging and loading it. During this time, she became permanently disabled due to wounds in her arm and chest. Margaret Corbin became the first woman in America to be paid with a disabled veteran's pension. Some ladies even cross-dressed to join the fight. For example, there's Deborah Sampson of Massachusetts. She pulled a Mulan and dressed as a man to fight in the Revolution. Deborah Sampson took on the name Robert Shirtleff as a pseudonym. She got injured at a fight in Tarrytown, New York. When Sampson went to the doctor to get her wounds healed, she didn't tell him about how a musket ball hit her thigh because that would expose her! So in a total kick butt and kind of gruesome move, she cut the bullet out of her leg herself and sewed the wound back up. Eventually, her true gender was revealed, and she was discharged with honor and received a soldier's pension. Some women made an impact quietly along the sidelines. Phyllis Wheatley, an African-American slave in Boston, wrote poetry about independence. Her most famous collection of poems is poems on various subjects, religious and moral. In addition to this, Wheatley also wrote a poem to George Washington titled To His Excellency, George Washington in 1775. She even had the honor of reading it to Washington a year later. Phyllis Wheatley won her freedom the following year when her master passed away. Now that you've heard about a few of the many honorable women in the American Revolutionary War, let's discredit one famous woman's legacy. Betsy Ross, as you all know, is known for making the first American flag. But after some research, people found out that the story has pretty much no proof to it. It was most likely made up at the centennial of the Declaration of Independence in 1876 and was encouraged by Ross's grandson, William Carby. Women in the American Revolution had just as much of an impact as the men. From fighting to boycotting goods to just writing, female colonists definitely influenced the result of the American Revolutionary War.
Wow. So what do you think about that? I mean, history. And we can't. I know it's so many things I want to say about that. We cannot destroy our history. I'll just leave it there, right? Because we have so much that's still to be uncovered. So again, I just think my hat is really off to these females, that the ones that stepped in for their husbands. Can you imagine being on the battlefield with your husband and your husband is killed in action? And no, you don't go home and mourn or, and just, fall into a slump. No, they actually moved in and took over the gunneries, or the whatever their duties were. They just moved in and kept fighting. Woo! And then, like I said, for Miss Osborne to reveal in her story that there were a lot of quote unquote colored women or women of color out there as well, doing the same thing. Not just working in the kitchen as cooks. And the young lady that went so far as to go to the medic for 2 of her wounds, but knowing that her gender would be revealed, took out her own bullet, and bullets aren't like they are today, right? She took that out. That had to leave a massive a scar, a wound in her leg. And then stitched it herself just to keep her gender revealed. All right, let's move on to the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. When the Union Army freed Black slaves, it did not consider them full citizens. Instead, the former slaves were considered contraband or property seized during the war. So many Black men and women then impressed into military service with the Army or the Navy, and Black women were therefore the first and only women to be drafted into the U.S. Armed Forces to date. Did you know that? That women were even drafted, period? Did you know? Okay, so then Black women cross-dressed. This is what we've been talking about. Again, here we are, and served as soldiers in the Union Army. Historians Deanne Blanton and Lorraine Cook Wise documented two that were probably, we know they're more just from what we just heard about the American Revolution, right? So at least some women who cross dressed as men to fight were never discovered. So can you imagine how many more there may be? Maybe they looked at them as little boys, because then the I guess the voice hasn't totally changed and they haven't fully developed. And back then they could fight at what age? Maybe 16? I don't know. I don't know. But so, and if somebody's listening and you know what the age was that they could start fighting, 13 even, maybe, I don't know, because I understand even to get married, they were in their teens. So maybe that's why the men really didn't pay attention to see that they were women, because they thought they were just young boys, young men. But at any rate, wow. The Civil War. So Mary Bowser, a former slave, um, manumitted by the Van Loo family of Richmond, yes, up in the north in this area, is assumed to be an illiterate slave woman named Ellen Bond, and is hired by Verena Davis to serve as a housemaid in the Confederate White House. Bowser may have had a photographic memory. Look at those gifts. And she passed information gained from Jefferson Davis papers and conversations to the Union Army through Spy Master. Now we're about to reveal a female spy back in the Civil War. Ooh, this sounds exciting to me, but I know it was very dangerous back then, right? Thomas McNiven, a Richmond baker. She fell under suspicion late in the war and in the spring of 1865 was forced to flee Richmond. Her last act upon leaving the city was an unsuccessful attempt to set fire to the Davis home. To protect spies, including Bowser, the War Department destroyed records of their service. So she never got any. Her family discarded her wartime diary in 1952, unaware of its significance. That was all she had to show what she had done back then. Later on, let's see, literate freed woman Susie King Taylor accompanies her husband to the first South Carolina Volunteers of African Descent, um, later reflagged as the 33rd United States Colored Troops. She serves as a nurse, laundress, and literacy teacher. She is the only Black woman known to have written a memoir of her Army experiences. Then Black women also served as nurses, often unpaid during the Civil War, and because they were still considered contraband. But Black women as first class boys to serve in the hospital ship USS Red Rover, they were able to get paid. Alice Kennedy, Sarah Keno, Ellen Kimball, Betsy Young, and Anne Bradford Stokes. The women served as nurses under the direction of nuns from the Nursing Order of the Sisters of Holy Cross. They received regular Navy wages. In 1890, Anne Bradford Stokes applied for and received a military disability pension. Black nurses also served with the 13th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, which saw action throughout the Shenandoah Valley, including the Second Battle of Bull Run and the battles of South Mountain, Anaheim, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and the Battle of the Wilderness. As many as 181 Black nurses, both female and male, served in convalescent in U.S. government hospitals in Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina during the Civil War. Harriet Tubman, who we all know, right, serves in a leadership role back then, riding one of two naval gunboats up the Combahee River on a guerrilla raid to destroy Confederate infrastructure. Because of her efforts, more than 700 slaves in the area were freed. So, what we've heard about Harriet Tubman, even after she did the Underground Railroad, now she's back fighting. Tubman persuaded 100 of the freed men, the people that she had helped get to their freedom, to enlist in the Union Army. The raid was possible because of intelligence collected by a network of spies that Tubman organized while she was serving in freedmen's relief work and supporting herself with cooking and brewing folk medicines for Union troops. So not only was she freeing slaves, leading the forces, she was also a medicinary. She was out there healing people. Then we move on to Kathy Williams, freed in the 13th Army Corps in Jefferson, Missouri, and subsequently impressed into the Union Army as a cook. Get this, disguised herself too as a man and enlisted in the 38th U.S. Infantry Company A. She serves until October 14th, 1868, at which point she revealed her gender and requested a discharge. Her 1892 request for a disability pension, although, was denied. At this time, I want to show another video just to bring to light a little bit of what I just shared with you from the Civil War. Wow, our women, they're so heroic. All right.
On an early October morning in 1864, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, met with abolitionist, activist, and African-American woman, Sojourner Truth. Truth would later write of the meeting, "It was about 8 o'clock a.m. when I called on the President. Upon entering his reception room, we found about a dozen persons in waiting, among them 2 colored women. The President was seated at his desk. Mrs. C. said to him, 'This is Sojourner Truth, who has come all the way from Michigan to see you.' He then arose, gave me his hand, made a bow, and said, 'I am pleased to see you.'" Although the exact tone and content of the meeting between Lincoln and Truth remains a point of debate among historians, Truth's visit to the White House symbolized the culmination of a lifetime devoted to abolitionism and activism. Truth was born in 1797 as Isabella Baumfree, a Dutch-speaking slave in rural New York. Isabella was sold several times before she finally became a free woman in 1826. In 1843, after what she referred to as being, quote, "called in spirit," Isabella Baumfree changed her name to Sojourner Truth and spent the rest of her life traveling the country as a lecturer and activist. With the start of the Civil War, Truth advocated for the inclusion of African American men in the Union Army, and once they were permitted to join, she worked to provide black regiments with food and clothing. Although Sojourner Truth's activism is well known, her story is but one of many that documents the variety of ways African American women contributed to the noble cause of freedom in the United States. Susie King Taylor was born into slavery on August 8, 1848, on the coast of Georgia. When Taylor was 14, she escaped with her uncle's family to the Union-controlled St. Catherine Island and eventually migrated to St. Simons Island. There she opened a school for African American children, and in 1862, Taylor married Sergeant Edward King of the 33rd U.S. Colored Infantry. Taylor traveled with her husband during the war, acting as the regiment's laundress, cook, teacher, and nurse. Much of what is known about Taylor comes from her own memoir, Reminiscence of My Life in Camp, with the 33rd United States Colored Troops, late 1st South Carolina Volunteers. In her book, Taylor describes numerous battles while also sharing personal anecdotes of camp life. Above all, Taylor's memoir conveys with deep personal meaning both the horror of war and the beauty of human compassion. She writes, It seems strange how our aversion to seeing suffering is overcome in war, how we are able to see the most sickening sights, such as men with their limbs blown off and mangled by the deadly shells, without a shudder, and instead of turning away, how we hurry to assist in alleviating their pain, with feelings of only sympathy and pity. While Susie King Taylor worked as a nurse for the Union Army, other African American women aided the cause of freedom in more surprising ways. As part of the war effort, Union forces often relied on so-called black dispatches, a term used among military officials for intelligence gathered by African Americans in the South. While several people became spies for the Union, one woman, Mary Bowser, worked to gather information at the heart of the Confederacy, in the home of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Unlike Susie King Taylor and Sojourner Truth, Mary Bowser's life is not well documented, and many historians debate her actual identity. Scholars generally agree that Bowser began her life as the slave of John Van Lew in Richmond, Virginia. Upon his death in 1843, the Van Lew family freed all of their slaves, including Bowser. Following her manumission, Mary Bowser continued to work as a domestic laborer for Elizabeth Van Lew, who had strong ties to the Union and established a spy system throughout the Confederate capital. According to some historians, because of Bowser's intelligence and photographic memory, Van Lew recruited her to spy on Jefferson Davis. At the Confederate White House, Bowser worked as a servant, cleaning and serving meals. However, she was also able to obtain information and report back to Van Lew through her Confederate spy network. After the war, some historians believe that Bowser, now going by the name Mary Richards, worked as a teacher in a freedmen's school in Georgia. While Mary Bowser disguised her identity to work as a Union spy, Kathy Williams donned a very different disguise. Born into slavery near Independence, Missouri around 1842, Williams was eventually impressed into service by the federal government to do laundry and cooking for Union soldiers. Kathy spent the remainder of the war attached to the Union Army, traveling throughout Arkansas, Louisiana, Georgia, and Washington, D.C. After the war, Kathy Williams, at the age of about 23, decided to enlist in the Army as a full-time soldier. Disguised as a man, Williams enlisted in 1866 for a 3-year tour of duty with the United States Regular Army in St. Louis, Missouri. When later asked why she disguised herself to join the Army, Williams stated that she wanted to make her own living without being dependent on friends or relatives. Williams' enlistment lasted just under 2 years, however, as an Army surgeon discovered her true gender after she became ill while stationed in New Mexico. Following her discharge, Williams returned to wearing women's clothing and went to work as a cook for an Army officer in Fort Union, New Mexico. In June 1891, she applied for a disability pension based on her military service, and it was then made public that an African-American woman had served in the regular Army as a Buffalo soldier. The stories of Kathy Williams, Mary Bowser, Susie King Taylor, and Sojourner Truth demonstrate that African-American women contributed to and aided Civil War efforts in a variety of crucial ways. Often lost, ignored, or simply overlooked in the history of the Civil War, these women's stories serve as an important reminder of Black women's active roles and experiences during wartime. In the closing pages of her memoir, Susie King Taylor perhaps best summarizes the feelings and thoughts many African American women may have had as they pondered what was at stake in this long and bloody conflict. She writes, "My people are striving to attain the full standard of all other races born free in the sight of God, and in a number of instances have succeeded. Justice, we ask, to be citizens of these United States, where so many of our people have shed their blood with their white comrades, that the stars and stripes should never be polluted."
Wow, now that one was deep, and it was put so eloquently, I think. And it wasn't meant for it to be a bit of black history, but just women's history untold. Because did you all know that she was a Buffalo Soldier? Did you all know about the young lady that was a spy? I mean, come on now. I mean, I know we've been hearing so many times, white or black, how many of the women dressed and disguised as men, or how many of the women ran to the helms when their husbands fell, but I'm not sure that our history books or even some of our other literature tell the true story about some of these other heroic women. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the Spanish American War, 1898. During this war, there were 100 Black women that served as contract nurses. And we're going to share with one nurse in particular who was the wife of a superintendent of the Freedmen's Hospital. Yes, that is now Howard University here in Washington, D.C. She went to New Orleans to recruit Black women as contract nurses. These nurses, who were often erroneously considered immune, handled the worst of the epidemics. Remember, Spanish American War? Yeah, another one of those pandemics, right? Many served in Santiago, Cuba, caring for patients infected during the epidemics, and two died from typhoid fever. Although many of the women seem to have been unskilled workers, five were graduates of a 3-year nursing training program at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Whether they were unskilled or not, they survived a pandemic and took care of our soldiers or our warriors at the time that were out there. And they were blessed, if I may say, because it says that it seemed as though they were immune to a pandemic. And you're out there, remember, everything we're doing today, they had no vaccine, no mask, no 6-foot distancing. And yet they took care of these wounded warriors out there dealing with this pandemic. I think that was a blessing. They were called for that service, if I may share that. Yes, I'm on an inspirational broadcast. So yes, I can share that, right? All right, I know. Right? So let's move on. Thank you. Thank you for all this service. And now World War One. As we come into the time frame that I think that I can recall any of my relatives, possibly talking about. All the others, I don't think I've heard any of my relatives or tell any stories to send the stories down of their livelihood or their service. But as we enter into World War One and World War Two, then it gets a little closer to home. Okay, so John Temple Rice, a chief of the U.S. Naval Muster Office, disregards the direction of Secretary of the Navy, Joseph, let me see, Daniels, to enlist Black women as Navy yeomen. He enlists 14, and they were considered the golden 14 to serve as a muster office clerk, right? As many as 30 Black women may have served in the Navy during World War One, some in other departments or locations, because they didn't all stay as clerks, all right? All right, but there's little that I could find on that. I tried to find the golden 14, so maybe I'll be able to research it a little later, but I couldn't for this particular episode. Couldn't find anything on them. So if you can, my listening audience, please share. Put the link in the comments if you're able to find more information on the Golden 14, okay? So although there were 18,000 Black nurses that were certified to serve with the Army Nurses Corps in the Red Cross, only a few were actually accepted for service. In the late 1918, the War Department reluctantly authorized 18 out of the 1,800, right? Only 18 African-American nurses to enroll in the Army Nurse Corps to deal with the influenza epidemic. Now, we just got out of the Spanish War, the epidemic, right? And they said that they were not very qualified Matter of fact, they said unskilled workers, they seem to be, right? But yet they were blessed to be immune. But now here we are in World War I, and they're coming right back into another epidemic. And they will only allow 18 of them to become properly skilled out there with another pandemic. Well, they call this one an epidemic, the flu epidemic, right? Just doesn't make sense to me. But at any rate, let me keep going with the history, right? They served in Camp Sherman, Army Nurse Corps to deal, Camp Sherman, Ohio, and Camp Grant, Illinois. One Eileen Cole Stewart remembered the story of the Negro nurse in World War I is not spectacular. We arrived after the armistice was signed, which alone was just inflammable, but each of us contributed quietly and with dignity to the idea that justice demands professional equality for all qualified nurses. None of the women received benefits or pensions as they did not serve in wartime. What is it called that we get? Hazardous pay, though. Was that not considered back then because they did not serve in wartime, but yet they took care of people in that had the influenza epidemic? I don't know. I would still think something. I guess maybe hazardous duty pay or whatever wasn't out back then. Okay. Let me close my mouth on that one. Don't want to get in any trouble. All right. So World War II. The Army Nurse Corps reluctantly began accepting African American nurses for service in World War II. Reluctantly. Due to a quota system, only a small number, now only 56, were allowed to join. On April 21st, Della Rainey Jackson, a graduate of Lincoln Hospital School of Nursing in Durham, North Carolina, became the first Black nurse to be commissioned to the U.S. Army. By April 1941, 48 African American nurses were assigned to Camp Livingston, Louisiana, and Fort Bragg in North Carolina. During World War II, African American nurses served in all theaters of the war, including Africa, Burma, Australia, and England. At the conclusion of World War II, approximately 600 African American nurses had served. Did you all even know that World War II had nurses in all of those areas? Nurses, period, in all of those areas. And then, let me see, Charity Adams early becomes the first Black woman commissioned in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Now, this wasn't just the WAC WAC, it was a WAAC WAC, the original WAC, right? The 25th Station Hospital Unit, including 30 Black nurses, was ordered to Liberia, care for the U.S. troops protecting strategic airfields and rubber plantations. Malaria. Here we go with another epidemic. Malaria was the most serious health problem the troops encountered. Although malarial patients required an intensive amount of care, much of this work was routine and could be rendered by trained corpsmen. The nurses felt superfluous, all right, superfluous, and unit morale declined. They felt like they weren't needed there. After they all trained up, and now they sent them to something that their corpsman or their battle buddy could tend to, right? The nurses were recalled late in 1943 because of poor health and low morale. Morale goes a long way. When, just like now, when we're saddened, depressed, and things like that, it causes other health issues. So therefore, they were trained and highly qualified, were sent out there for what we would call menial work. And it bothers your psyche to say, now I'm overqualified And I have the qualifications now, whether it be a Black woman or just a woman being out there to do the work. Now I have the qualifications, and now you won't allow me to use my qualifications. And that is still, in a sense, discrimination, whether we want to say just for women or we want to add the nationality onto it. It's still a sense of discrimination, and it still lowers your self-esteem. So therefore, they ended up getting sick, some of them, because they were being unutilized, right? So generally, what will happen is your immune system will start to decline because of the emotional state that you're in. So let me continue. Um, so this general, so they went back to the United States. Others went to the 383rd and the 335th Station Hospital near this was in Burma, where they treated Black troops working on the Lido Road. Another group of 15 nurses deployed to the Southwest Pacific area in the summer of 1943 with the all-Black 268th Station Hospital. In June of 1944, a unit of 63 nurses went to the 168th Station Hospital in England to care for German prisoners of war. By the end of the war, Black nurses had served in Africa, England, Burma, and the Southwest Pacific. So now we have another registered nurse, Janet Bragg, had earned a private pilot's license in 1933. She owned her own airlines and was a founder of a segregated airfield outside of Chicago. Like another female pilot, Mildred Hemmons, when Bragg applied to the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, was then called the WASP. In 1943, director Jackie Cochran, turned her away because of her race. She continued to fly, earning a commercial pilot license. These women, overachievers, I tell you. By 1943, 183 African American nurses led commissions in the Army Nurse Corps, approximately 6%, the total strength of the Army Nurses Corps. The numbers were limited by racial quotas. So we even had quotas back then. But now let's move on to the battalion of the 6888 Central Postal Battalion, commanded by Major Charity Adams, deployed to the UK. The 800 women were stationed in England for 3 months, moved to France, and finally settled in Paris. The battalion redirected mail to all U.S. personnel in the European theater of operations, including the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, civilian, and Red Cross workers. A total of over 7 million people. When mail could not be delivered to the addresses on the face of the envelope, it was sent to the postal directory to be redirected. The 6888 kept an updated information card on each person in theater. Some personnel at first moved frequently, often requiring several information updates per month. The WACs worked 3 8-hour shifts, 7 days a week, to clear out the tremendous backlog of Christmas mail. Each shift averaged 65,000 pieces of mail. Although the women's workload was heavy, their spirits were high because they realized how important their work was in keeping up morale at the front. Now, do you see just the opposite of what happened with the nurses? The morale was up because they felt like their work was contributing to the soldiers that were on the line. And they knew that their work would help to keep up the morale of the soldiers that were fighting, right? So they felt important. They felt needed, totally the opposite of the nurses. And therefore, they were able to keep their morale up and stay healthy. All right, Phyllis May Daly, also a Black nurse, sworn into the Navy Nurses Corps. First Lieutenant Nancy, is it Lieutenant, becomes first Black woman to become a regular member of the regular Army Nurses Corps. Now, before I go into the Korean War, I have another video to share with you that's going back to World War I. So I've just shared World War I and World War II. Now let's go to the video, please.
World War I did much to accelerate the technological and political upheavals already brewing at the turn of the 20th century. But the changes to the societal order were a bombshell all their own. You might know about Marie Curie's groundbreaking work in physics and chemistry. But did you know that Curie and her daughter personally led a corps of intrepid women who delivered portable X-ray devices to the front lines? How about the battle-tested female doctors and nurses whose guts and determination paved the way for women's suffrage? Or the African-American nurses who shattered color and gender lines while saving lives? Britannica explores these untold stories of women who changed the world from the home front to the battlefront of the First World War. When war broke out in 1914, Marie Curie had just established the Radium Institute in Paris. With German armies encroaching on the French capital, Curie gathered her entire supply of radium, stashed it in a remote bank vault, and set off to put her science skills to a daring new test. Curie was a Nobel-winning scientist, not a soldier, but she knew there was one way her work could make difference to the war effort. Early X-ray machines were enormous and found only in the most advanced hospitals of the day, not exactly convenient to the front lines. So Curie designed a portable one, a device which would forever revolutionize medicine on and off the battlefield. Curie's first mobile radiology lab must have seemed like something hatched by a mad scientist, combining an X-ray machine, a darkroom for developing images, and a dynamo, an electric generator, to power the process. For the first time, military doctors could detect the most minute pieces, bullets and shrapnel lodged in wounds, without having to transport casualties. Soldiers at the front dubbed the portable X-ray labs Petite Curies, or Little Curies, and Curie enlisted her teenage daughter, Irene, as her assistant. Curie not only taught herself basic automotive maintenance, but also how to drive. She soon had a fleet of 20 Petite Curies servicing the front lines. As the cars were useless without trained technicians, Curie personally trained at least 150 women in the fundamentals of radiology, anatomy, car repair, and photo processing. After the Western Front stabilized, Curie established some 200 radiological labs in battlefield hospitals. Thanks to her determination, an estimated 1 million Allied soldiers would receive X-rays during the war, saving untold lives in the process. In the years after the war, the portable X-ray unit underwent significant advances, and it remains a fixture of battlefield hospitals to this day. Mabel St. Clair Stobart was a product of the British upper classes. Like other suffragettes of her day, she felt strongly that women should be afforded the same rights as men. Unlike other suffragettes, however, Stobart believed that demonstrating the value of women on the battlefield would help secure their right to vote. Originally a member of the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, an all-women's medical auxiliary, Stobart broke away in 1910 and founded her own organization, the Women's Sick and Wounded Convoy Corps. In the summer of 1910, Stobart led dozens of female volunteers through a week of training in the English countryside. The course covered first aid techniques as well as basic military skills, such as marching and signal recognition. When the First Balkan War erupted in 1912, Stobart approached Sir Frederick Treves, the head of the British Red Cross, to offer the services of her organization. When Treves told her that women had no place on a battlefield, Stobart simply bypassed him and took her group to Serbia and later Bulgaria. To finance their mission, Stobart used her influence in British high society, essentially crowdfunding the whole project. The Convoy Corps spent the duration of the war at the front, with women working as doctors, drivers, orderlies, and administrators. The Convoy Corps returned to England in 1913, and when World War I broke out the following year, Stobart again petitioned the Red Cross for an assignment. Treves again dismissed the performance of the Convoy Corps in the Balkan Wars as, quote, exceptional, end quote, implying that it could not be repeated. Stobart later wrote that, quote, action is a universal language which all can understand, end quote. Once again, she simply sidestepped Treves and made her own arrangements. Stobart's troops served first in Belgium and then in Serbia. She was commissioned as a major in the Serbian army, becoming the first woman to hold that rank in a national armed force. When German forces broke through Serbian defenses, she led her unit and a column of refugees over 200 miles of mountainous terrain to safety in Albania. After Stobart returned to England, her wartime heroics were widely publicized, and she took the opportunity to continue speaking up for women's rights. By the end of the war, the United Kingdom had passed a law that gave some women the right to vote, and full suffrage came not long after. When the U.S. Army Nursing Corps was established in 1901, its ranks were limited to white women. But during World War I, the increased need for medical services led the Army to admit a number of African American nurses. One of them was Aileen Cole Stewart. Stewart first received recognition in 1918 when she helped the Red Cross monitor the Spanish influenza pandemic in West Virginia. Miners were key to any war effort for the precious fuel they provided for an army. Keeping them healthy became a top priority. Stewart went to work in Bretz, a small town in northeast West Virginia, where she monitored the health of some 20 families. Just after the armistice ended the war in November 1918, she was asked to serve in the U.S. Army. After an intense training course, she was sent to Camp Sherman in Ohio, where she nursed ailing soldiers. Though it would be another 3 decades before the Nurse Corps became fully and permanently integrated, Stewart and her fellow African American nurses proved that all women were capable of serving their country with honor. Marie, Mabel, and Aileen weren't the only heroines of World War I, but their stories remind us of how the horrors of a conflict on that scale, the likes of which the world had never seen, brought out the best and the brightest of every part of society, especially those who hadn't been given the chance before.
So, as we close out this episode for today, I want us to remember. So, we also have next the Korean War and then the Vietnam War era. We do still have loved ones that are with us from the Korean War and the Vietnam era. So, just like we celebrate women this month is also the time frame, I do believe, to pay tribute to our Vietnam era, war era survivors as well. And for the tribute, just pay tribute to the Vietnam War era. So if you have a loved one that is still with us, please remember to thank them for their service this month, as well as your women, whether they are in uniform or not. Honor your women. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Live Today Health Talk. I pray that there's something I shared that may have inspired you, some tidbit that you may have never known before that you can take and share. Remember, the objective of this program is to share knowledge with you that will empower you, but that you can also continue to share our history, our health message, and just anything else. If there's something else you'd like to hear about, put it in the comments and we will gladly consider it. Have a wonderful day. Remember, the spring is coming. Enjoy. I'm out.